May 5th, 1945. The war in Europe had 4 days left to live, and a German major, a man who had spent 6 years fighting for the Third Reich, was about to walk into an American command post and ask for help, not to surrender, not to negotiate safe passage for himself or his men. He came to ask the Americans to fight alongside him, against the SS. What you are about to hear is not a story that appears in most history textbooks. It does not fit neatly into the narrative of World War II that most of us learn. The clean arc of Allied triumph, Nazi defeat, and justice delivered. This story is stranger than that, more human, and in certain ways, more disturbing. It is the story of the battle for Castle Itter, the last battle of the war in Europe. And one of the only battles in which American soldiers and German soldiers fought on the same side. Schloss Itter sits in the Austrian Tyrol, perched above a narrow river gorge in the Inn Valley. Medieval in origin. Stone walls 3 feet thick. A tower that looks over the valley like a sentinel. By 1943, the SS had converted it into a high-security prison. Not for ordinary inmates. The SS understood the value of certain prisoners, not as people, but as leverage. Schloss Itter held what the Germans called Ehrenhäftling, honor prisoners, filles et pairs. Among them, former French Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, the 2 men who had led France at the moment of its greatest defeat, General Maxime Weygand, the supreme commander of French forces during the fall of France. Tennis star Jean Borotra, once the most celebrated athlete in France. General Gustave Gamelin, commander-in-chief during the Battle of France. Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. And Léon Jouot, one of the most prominent Labour leaders in French history, who would go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1951. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were trophies, hostages, people whose survival or death could still shape the post-war world. The SS garrison at Itter knew this, and as the war collapsed around them in the spring of 1945, some of them began to ask themselves a question. What do you do with trophies when the museum is burning down? By late April 1945, the Wehrmacht was dissolving. Not in the orderly way that military collapse is sometimes described in history books, a controlled retreat, a negotiated armistice. It was disintegration. Units were cut off from headquarters. Officers received no orders. Men stripped off their insignia and walked home through the mountains. In this chaos, 2 very different groups of Germans emerged. The first were ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, tired, hungry, and increasingly aware that the war they had been fighting for 6 years was over. Many of them just wanted to survive, to reach American or British lines before the Soviets, to put down their weapons before someone put them down permanently. The second group was different. The SS, specifically the fanatical hardcore of the Waffen-SS and the Totenkopf formations, had no such pragmatism. Their ideology was their identity, and their ideology told them that surrender was betrayal, that the war could still be won, or if not won, then made to cost the enemy as much as possible. Some SS units were executing German soldiers for desertion in those final days. Others were murdering civilians. And at Schloss Itter, the SS garrison was debating what to do with the prisoners. The prisoners themselves understood what that debate might conclude. The SS man responsible for Itter was an Oberscharführer named Sebastian Wimmer. He was not a monster of the ideological kind, not, it seems, a true believer who would die for the Reich with a song on his lips. He was something more banal, a bureaucrat with a gun, a man who had run this prison because someone had to, and because it had kept him away from the Eastern Front. As May arrived, and the American 12th Armored Division pushed into the Tyrol, Wimmer made a decision. He abandoned the castle. He left, took his men. So he walked away. The prisoners were left with a skeleton staff of anti-Nazi Austrian fighters and the castle cook, free in a technical sense, but stranded on a mountainside, surrounded by retreating Wehrmacht units and roving SS execution squads, with no way out and no weapons to speak of. One of them had to do something. Enter the German Wehrmacht major. His name was Josef Gangl. He was 34 years old. He had served on the Eastern Front, been decorated, and somewhere in the grinding horror of that campaign, he had concluded that the war was not only lost, but that it had been criminal. By 1945, Gangl was working with the Austrian resistance, secretly, risking execution daily, passing information to American forces, organizing anti-Nazi networks, trying to position himself and like-minded soldiers to prevent further atrocities as the war ended. When news reached him that the prisoners at Schloss Itter were in danger, that SS units in the area were preparing to liquidate high-value captives rather than let them fall into Allied hands, Gangl acted. He went to the Americans. Specifically, he went to First Lieutenant John Lee of the 12th Armored Division. Lee was 27 years old, a tank commander, and whatever he had been trained to expect from this war, it was probably not a German Wehrmacht officer walking into his command post and asking him to mount a rescue mission to a medieval castle. Gangl laid it out plainly. The French VYPs, the SS threat. The window of time that was closing. Lee listened. And then, in a decision that required either extraordinary courage or extraordinary confidence, or possibly both, he said yes. On the morning of May 5th, 1945, a column assembled outside the town of Wörgl. It was unlike any formation in the history of the conflict. Lee had initially assembled several tanks, but the route to the castle crossed a bridge too weak to bear their weight. Most had to be left behind. He pressed on with what he could bring, one Sherman tank and a handful of American GIs from the 12th Armored Division. Alongside them, approximately 10 Wehrmacht soldiers, German artillerymen, armed, wearing the uniforms of the army that had been America's enemy for 3 years, fighting under Lee's command. The prisoners at the castle had also improvised their own contribution. Paul Reynaud, former Prime Minister of France, a man in his mid-60s who had spent years in German captivity, helped organize a defensive perimeter inside the castle walls. Jean Borotra, still lean and athletic, volunteered to climb down the castle walls and go for help if communications failed. They were going to have to hold, because the SS was coming. An SS unit, believed to be from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, was advancing toward Itter. Whether their intent was to execute the prisoners, or simply to destroy anything in their path in a final act of defiance, the result would be the same. At around 4 a.m. on May 5th, the SS attacked. The castle's approach was exposed. The road leading up to the gate, the bridge over the gorge, the tree line, all of it became contested ground as the SS assault began. The Sherman tank, positioned at the castle gate, became the anchor of the defence. Its gun covered the main approach. Without it, the position could not hold. But the Sherman was vulnerable, and the SS knew how to fight armour. The battle was long. It would last the better part of 12 hours. American soldiers traded fire with SS troops across the gorge and along the forest edge. German Wehrmacht soldiers, Gangl's men, fought beside them, defending a position that would have been unimaginable to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. Inside the castle, the prisoners sheltered. Some took weapons. Gamelin, the old general, reportedly refused to simply wait. Reynaud organized. They were, these aging French statesmen and generals, not passive participants in their own rescue. Joseph Gangl was killed during the battle, an SS sniper's bullet. He died defending French prisoners alongside American soldiers, wearing the uniform of the army that had conquered France 5 years earlier. The Sherman was eventually knocked out by an 88mm gun. The small garrison, Americans, Wehrmacht soldiers, and castle prisoners alike, held on through the afternoon until relief finally arrived. Around 4 p.m., elements of the 142nd Infantry Regiment reached the castle. The SS withdrew. The prisoners were safe. The last battle of World War II in Europe was over. What happened after is almost quieter than the battle itself. The prisoners were evacuated. They were photographed, some of them, looking bewildered and exhausted. Old men in rumpled suits blinking in the May sunlight. Paul Reynaud shook Captain Lee's hand. Lee was promoted to captain in recognition of his actions at Itter, the rank that would follow him into history. Jean Borotra wept. General Weygand, who had signed the armistice that had surrendered France to Germany in 1940, who had been blamed by many for the defeat, who had spent years as a prisoner because of the politics that followed that moment, walked out of Schloss Itter a free man. Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Joseph Gangl was posthumously honoured by the Austrian Republic. Today, there is a street named for him in Wörgl, the very town where he gathered his small, impossible coalition, and a memorial to mark what happened. The French prisoners returned to France, to a country that was still deciding, in 1945, how to feel about all the things that had happened. Reynaud and Daladier and Gamelin would all live to see France rebuilt. Some of them would return to politics. Some would write memoirs. And Léon Jouot, the Labour leader who had survived years of captivity, would go on to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1951. All of them would carry the memory of that morning, the sounds of a battle being fought for them by men who had once been their enemies. There is something that does not resolve neatly about this story. That is perhaps why it is told less often than it should be. It does not fit the taxonomy of World War II that we prefer. The clean categories, Allied and Axis, liberator and oppressor, those who resisted and those who collaborated, are complicated by a German officer who risked his life for French prisoners, by American soldiers who accepted that help without hesitation, by Wehrmacht, men who, in the last hours of a criminal war they had served, chose to make one different decision. What do we do with Joseph Gangl? He served the Wehrmacht. He fought on the Eastern Front. We do not know, and cannot know, the full accounting of what he did in those years before his resistance began. Many men who eventually opposed the Nazi regime had, at some earlier point, carried out its orders. History rarely offers the clean moral arithmetic we want from it. What we have is this: a man who, at the moment it mattered, walked into an enemy command post and said there are people who need saving, and I need your help to save them. And an American officer who looked at the situation, at the German uniform, at the impossible proposition, at the collapsing world, and decided that the answer was yes. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, 3 days after the guns fell silent at Schloss Itter. The castle still stands. You can visit it. Tourists come in the summer to see the medieval walls, the tower, the views over the Inn Valley. Most of them do not know what happened there on the morning of May 5, 1945. But somewhere in those stones is the echo of something strange and human and worth remembering. A German soldier who chose to fight alongside his enemies. An American officer who chose to trust his enemy. And a question that the battle raised and never fully answered, about what men are capable of, at the very end, when the structures that define them are already ash. Josef Gangl was buried in Virgil. His grave faces the mountains. The war is over. The question isn't,